Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Shilpen Savani. I'm a partner at Gunnar Cook. I have a dual specialism in that I am an employment lawyer, but I'm also a dispute resolution specialist. And I've spent the last 3 months largely troubleshooting for clients and very focused on dealing with the economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic. A lot of that time has been focused on dealing with the issues we're looking at today.
Hi everyone, morning. I'm Paul Ryman. I'm an employment partner at Gunnar Cook, and like Shilpen, since the pandemic hit, I've been helping clients to try and navigate their way through it, including in relation to the furlough scheme and the seemingly endless, infinite permutations that can impact on real life. So before we start today, can I just deal with a couple of points on etiquette, please? The first one is if I could ask everyone to please mute your microphones, and also if you could please turn your cameras off, and if you have any questions, if you could direct it to the chat bar, then Shilpen and I can try and answer those at the end of the webinar.
Thanks, Paul. So for those of us who joined us on the last occasion, because this is really a follow-up on a seminar, on a webinar we did about 5 or 6 weeks ago. On the last occasion, we presented a day after the furlough scheme portal had opened. And there was a lot of anticipation and a lot of concern about exactly how that would work and what would happen, or even if it would work at all, basically. Well, that largely has been a success. I think most would say that it actually had a very smooth start and has continued in quite a smooth way. Recent stats suggested that over 8.5 million jobs have been saved by the scheme, which I think by any standards is a remarkable achievement. And that's before you even get to the self-employment income protection scheme, which we'll be talking to you about today as well. On this occasion, again, it's quite timely because the government has just launched or released a number of rules and clarifications relating to the continuation and extension of both schemes. And again, that's what we're going to be talking to you about today. We're hoping to leave you with or to provide you with a practical, jargon-free overview of where we are, both from an employer's perspective, but also from an employee or from a worker perspective. But also, we're going to try and leave you with some tips as to exactly how you might want to be thinking about dealing with these issues going forward. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Shilpen. So just to start, it might be helpful just to recap on the job retention scheme. So the purpose of the scheme is to avoid redundancies. The aim is to take pressure off employers by the government effectively stepping in and paying wages, wage costs up to 80%, capped at £2,500 per employee per month. The scheme ran from the 1st of March. It's now been confirmed that's going to end on the 31st of October. As Shilpen just mentioned, there's 8.5 million employees have been furloughed. £17.5 billion has been claimed. And I think the evidence is that the scheme has worked. From what I've read and from my experience of what I've heard from clients, claims have been paid within the 7 days. Clearly it's not perfect, but I think it seems to be, certainly is an area I think that there's public consensus that the government have acted well during the crisis. There's something I have read a few pieces about this in the last few days about fraud and about how the revenue is live to the fact that there may well be, well, I think inevitably there will be some fraudulent claims going on, and they're going to allocate I think quite considerable resources to sort of chasing that down. Although they have clarified they're not going to punish people for honest mistakes, because obviously it's not a straightforward scheme. But I think that might be something to keep an eye on. So that's you, Shilpen.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I'm afraid that's going to run. I mean, there are increasing reports of the whistleblowing line being used and abuses being uncovered, and I'm afraid that's going to run on and on. It seems, along with every honest claim, there seems to be quite a few that are less than honest claims. Turning now to who's covered by the scheme, it's actually quite simple. Any employee that was on the PAYE payroll of an employer as at the 19th of March in simple terms, is eligible or was eligible. In terms of scope, again, it's quite simple because it's actually a very broad definition. It includes full-time workers, part-time workers, agency workers, 0 hours workers. So it doesn't discriminate in terms of sort of how much work these people, employees may do. And it also extends to company directors and office holders if they're on PAYE. So really the litmus test is where these individuals on PAYE at the relevant cutoff points. Speaking of cutoff points, going forward for the extension of the scheme, as of the 1st of July, only employees for whom claims have been made by the 10th of June will be eligible. So there is a reducing of scope that's going on, basically, which I guess is understandable given that there's been time to kind of narrow and sort of sharpen up the scheme, but also because of the just vast amounts of public funds that are being spent on this scheme. Paul?
Yeah, sure. So looking at the new rules, these came out on Friday, and they're effective from the 1st of July. Now, there's quite a lot of detail. The way the government have gone about this is there's no new document as such that just covers off all these rules. They've added to the existing guidance that's already out there, and that's kind of evolved and grown as the scheme has gone on. So there's probably about 6 or 7 different guidance docs. But I must say, having read through them, there's quite a lot to take in, and I don't think everyone's sort of fully digested it yet. But, you know, I think it reads quite well. No doubt there'll be some gaps, but there's some good points in there, not only in relation to the changes, but some quite helpful clarification points on things like, you know, sick leave and furlough or holidays and furlough. The best document, I think, for you to start with, there's one that's called Check if you can claim for your employees' wages through the CJRS. So that's check if you can claim for your employees' wages through the CJRS. That's the kind of the gateway, because then that links into all the various other pages that give you the guidance. So just running through the key changes. So the first one is the big one, which is flexible furlough. So this is a phrase that didn't exist before Friday, but now will be on the tip of everyone's tongue. So flexible furlough. This is addressing, I think, probably the big problem with the prior scheme, which is that you couldn't be on furlough and work, and you had to be on furlough for 3 weeks. So now you can work part-time and you can claim, or the employer can claim, the proportional furlough pay for the hours that the employee's not working. That's effective from the 1st of July. From August, the government is going to start asking employers to sort of incrementally start topping up the payment. So from August, employers have got to pay national insurance contributions, employer national insurance contributions and pension contributions. From September, the government are going to knock down the contribution from 80% to 70%, and the cap goes down to £2,187.50. But employers have to top that up to 80% or £2,500. And then from October, it's going to get knocked down again to 60%, and the cap comes down to 1,875. And again, the employer will have to top up to 80% or £2,500 as appropriate. The length of time that someone needs to be furloughed now, there is no minimum length. So it used to be 3 weeks. Now it can be for any length that you want, but it's important to note that the claim period has to be at least 7 days. So you'd only be able to have essentially 4 claim periods per month. But the actual days on furlough, there's no minimum. There's detailed rules on how you claim and how you work out flexible working hours. It's quite complicated, but actually when you look at that, there's a lot of info and there's worked examples. So I think the starting point would be to kind of work your way through that, because I think that should give you the answers. In summary, you work out someone's usual hours depending upon whether they're fixed or variable, and then you just claim for any of those hours that they're not working whilst they're placed on furlough. One potential issue which I've spotted, which we may hear more about in due course, is that when you're defining if someone's on variable hours, that can be if their pay depends on the number of hours worked. which I think could potentially include overtime. So you could have someone on, 40 hours a week, but then if they get paid X amount of pounds for overtime, then are they variable? So I think that could be a bit of a contentious point. In practical terms, you will need to get a new agreement in writing to place someone on flexible furlough. And I think anyway, most furlough agreements I've seen have said that they'll run to the end of June, and the contractual variations that they affect will run to the end of June. So I think even if you're not going to put someone on flexible furlough, you just need to have a look at your existing furlough agreements and check if you need to get, roll out new ones. You're going to have to keep a record of hours worked and hours furloughed. And also, just another point is that the definition of work has changed. So when they were talking about furlough before and you couldn't do work, it was just limited effectively to you couldn't generate revenue. But now, the rules say that you can't generate revenue or provide a service. And that just made me think of conversations I've had with, for example, directors who have been furloughed and said, I'm doing a strategy report for the board. Is that okay? It's not generating revenue. So I think that was okay. Now, is it providing a service? I mean, it may well be a statutory duty, but there's a question mark. So it may well be that if there is some elements of work that people are doing, you could come back off furlough for 1 day a week or something like that. So that's something to just give a little bit of thought to.
No, that's a good point, Paul. I think this question of whether you can work or not, it's dogged a lot of employers since the scheme started. And it has been a very binary sort of black and white scenario. For my 2 pennies, I would say rather than worrying about the grey area of whether you're working or not on furlough, now that there will be a great degree of flexibility as of July, I would say if there is anything that remotely borders work, those are days that you should not claim for. And the other days will be days that you can rightfully claim for. And I think it's better to avoid any confusion over that, just so you don't invite unnecessary scrutiny from HMRC over quite a straightforward scenario, actually. Turning now to looking at sort of room for improvement. As both of us have already said, we think that the scheme has been quite a success, I think, by any standards. There was a lot of negativity around it, but when you think about the speed and the circumstances under which the scheme was rolled out, I think it's been both organised and effective. But there are probably two things. One more important than the other, I think. The first one is if the flexible element has come in too late. It's a very welcome development, but in many respects, businesses could have benefited from this had it come in much earlier. And query if it would have saved some money from the public purse as well, because it might not have led to this literally sort of black or white, in or out furlough scenario with a minimum of 3 weeks at a time. But moving on to what I think is really the big question here, the big issue really for all of us to contend with, is it's great that the government scheme has worked. It's great that the government scheme has been extended. And I think the tapering element is inevitable, where there's a greater investment from employers who want to keep using the scheme. But are we facing a cliff edge as of the 1st of November? And if we are we looking at essentially a bloodbath in the workplace, later this year? The pessimists would say, yes, absolutely we are. And it's something that should never have been sort of postponed anyway in the first place, because it's inevitable. The optimists and those who believe that a softer landing is justified, and I'm one of them, takes the view that I think the answer actually is for a continuation of the tapering. So certainly I'm holding out for the possibility that the government will recognise the need for that and bring in a degree of tapering and continuation of the scheme, so that it's the country is gradually weaned off it, as opposed to a guillotine edge at the end of October. We're now going to turn to the self-employed income support scheme. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Shilpen. Yeah, so just to kind of recap on the self-employed scheme, this was for eligible self-employed people. They could get a taxable grant of 80% of their average monthly trading profit over the last 3 years, and that was up to a maximum of 2.5k per month. You had to claim, or you have to claim by the 13th of July for the first payment, and it's done in a lump sum, covers March, April and May, and the revenue starts hope to start making the payments from the beginning of June. On the 29th of May, the Chancellor extended the scheme, so now there's going to be a second, and it's said to be a final grant, which is claimed in August, and that applies to June, July, and August, and that's calculated at 70% of the average monthly trading profits, and that's up to a reduced amount of £2,190 per month. So Shilpen's going to talk about who's covered now.
Yes, sorry. Thanks for that, Paul. Sorry, I just lost my thread there for a moment. Yes, the scheme basically applies to self-employed individuals and members of a partnership. It does not apply to limited companies, so it is of quite a limited sort of application, unlike the CJRS scheme. Really, the benchmark for eligibility and whether you can actually claim is going to be the last year's tax return, so the 2018 and 2019 self-assessment tax return. And one of the requirements, preconditions, is that your trading profits must be no more than £50,000 and at least equal to your non-trading income. If you're not eligible based on that tax year, then there is the option of looking back over an average for the previous 3 tax years. But that hopefully gives you a sort of a snapshot of how you qualify for the scheme. Paul?
Yeah, so in terms of the current landscape, so new guidance again was published on Friday for this. As I just said, this second grant is said to be final, so it doesn't look like there are going to be any further amendments on the cards at the moment, either to extend it or also to just help people who slip through the net, as Shilpen just said. You know, there's a bit of an arbitrary parameter for this scheme, and I think there's 1 million people self-employed who aren't covered by this for various reasons. Mm-hmm. There doesn't seem to be anything, you know, in motion at the moment that the government are doing to deal with that, and then maybe just saying that's it. Basically, benefits will kind of plug the gaps. Eligibility for this second grant is exactly the same as the first, so just as Shilpen has mentioned, and you can apply for the second grant even if you haven't claimed for the first. The condition is that you've got to show that your business has been affected by coronavirus on or after the 14th of July. And I would imagine that in some way that probably covers pretty much every business in the UK. So I think that's quite a low hurdle, but I guess that's the point of it. That the government wants to, it's effectively a way of rolling out benefits to people, so they want to keep it quite wide. The portal's not open yet, but I think the guidance is saying that you'll be able to claim in August. But I think something important to note, if you are going to make a claim under the scheme, I haven't seen this on the guidance before, but there's now a warning saying that if you claim under the self-employed scheme, you've got to make that claim yourself. Your advisor or your accountant can't make that claim on your behalf, or it will trigger a fraud alert. It doesn't explain why, but it says it will trigger a fraud alert and it may delay payment. So that's a difference to the CJRS, which is, you know, most businesses, well, they payroll, but a lot of accountants and advisors are doing it on their behalf. So if you're going to claim under the self-employed scheme, it's important that you make that claim yourself. So over to you, Shilpen, to look for room for improvement in the scheme.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, that's an oddity, isn't it, that development? I mean, you wonder what the logic behind that is. It's probably plugging a gap. There's probably been some abuse that's been identified.
Yeah.
And they're probably making declarations, you know, which they want, the HMRC wants the individual to make, you know, as opposed to a representative. But that is, it does seem a little bit over the top. So turning now to room for improvement. Again, it's landed on my plate to pick holes in the scheme. But again, I think I think this has been a successful and effective scheme. It had a rocky and slow start, but overall, it seems to have worked quite well. Having said that, I think that there are probably 2 really sort of major problems here. One is, again, the cliff edge. Yeah, this scheme is going to end at the end of August. The government guidance has made it clear that this is a final extension, so we're not looking at further extensions of this scheme. and so query, where does that leave the million or so people that are claiming under the scheme at a time when we're still facing historically uncertain economic conditions, and query whether drawing the line in such a hard way is necessary or appropriate. The second thing here is there's no apparent reason or ration for why the self-employed sector of the economy is being offered less support here than employees, and it is odd that the employees will be looked after until the end of October as things stand, possibly beyond if what I'm hoping for materializes, whereas self-employed individuals are being sort of cut off really as of the end of August, and that does seem quite inequitable, but also quite wrong in circumstances where this has been, a huge growth sector, especially in the last 5 years. So when you think in terms of self-employed individuals, that includes the gig economy basically, and everyone that's involved in that in increasing numbers. So once again, to me, I think that's a gaping hole here, which is why is the scheme being cut off as quickly as it is when employees clearly are being favoured in terms of the treatment they're receiving here. That ends our sort of whistle-stop tour of the two schemes and kind of a review of where the schemes stand right now. We are now going to look at some messages, some tips, and some conclusions that we've drawn out of all of this to give you some practical guidelines and guidance. After which, we're very happy to discuss any points that arise or to take any questions. So Paul, over to you, really.
Okay, thanks, Shilpen. So the first point, I think, is that you're going to need to plan for flexible furlough. It's a really positive step. It's going to give, I think, businesses a great option. And so many conversations I had when I was advising companies on what they, how they kind of furlough people, they were saying, look, we've got some work, but we just don't have enough work to pay our workforce. The answer was, you just, you couldn't keep people, that were furloughed. You couldn't allow them to attend to the small amount of work that they had, or also you couldn't allow them to attend to trying to, plan and develop business for when this ended. So it was a real issue, and it's a positive step, but it's going to require a lot of logistics. So you're going to have to agree with employees what hours they're going to work. That's going to have to be a new agreement. If you're doing that for 20 or more people, that could potentially involve collective consultation with reps and all the other requirements. You're going to have to keep records of the hours that people work. So, the factory situation, that might be, for example, that might be quite straightforward. But if people are in an office, that's not something that businesses normally do. So that's a new aspect. And you're going to have to try and estimate demand and your staff capacity, because when you make a claim for flexible furlough, if the employee ends up working longer hours than you've claimed for, then you'll have to repay some of the money. So it's going to require a bit of planning. And I think really it's the kind of thing that's suited to patterns of work. I suspect it's not going to really be working on an ad hoc basis, but if someone wants to come in, they're going to work half days or 3 days a week or whatever it may be. I think that kind of routine pattern, I think that will probably fit in. And then once you get up to speed, that might run quite smoothly through to October.
Yes, absolutely. And a practical point on that is that although there is no minimum period anymore, or there won't be as of next month, for furlough. So in order to enable the flexible furlough, it really is a flexible furlough. But you can only make up to 4 claims a month per employee, which I think really in practical terms will break down to furlough playing itself out on a weekly basis, at a minimum on periods of 7 days at a time. But one way or the other, I think this is a really important development, and I think those employers that are using furlough should really embrace the option of a more flexible way to do that. Moving on from that, really, is also, and equally important, I would suggest, is starting to plan for life after the scheme ends. You've already heard our thoughts on the danger of a cliff edge and a very sort of hard stop, basically, at the end of October. But for now, that's something that you should be preparing for and allowing for. If you're an employee, then you've got to be thinking about whether your role, whether you believe your role is going to be sustainable beyond that date. You may want to be having a discussion with your employer about this and understand what their thinking is, and try to approach this in a mature, but also in a sort of an open discussion sort of way. From an employer's perspective, I think this is the time to be calculating the costs of furlough, budgeting for what you can and can't offset by using the scheme. But also, it's a practical pointer is that you can dismiss employees whilst on furlough. I mean, it does open up a few issues and tricky sort of considerations, but strictly speaking, it can be done. So query whether you want to have employees that are still working, but working their notice periods during furlough to soften the blow financially to your business. The other thing also is that it is generally expected for employers to raise redundancy issues and to consult sooner rather than later. So if you know that's going to happen, then it is sensible to be planning ahead for this, especially because if you're considering more than 20 redundancies within 90 days, so this really focuses on the larger employers, you're looking at a consultation period, a minimum consultation period of 30 days, or I think once you're over 90 employees, it's 45 days, I believe, Paul, isn't it?
100 employees.
Oh, 100 employees, okay.
Yeah.
So all the more reason to be thinking about it, because you ideally want your consultations to have been done before the furlough scheme ends, if that's how you choose to plan for the medium term.
Yeah, and I think that what I've advised on quite a few redundancy processes at the moment, and I think there's been two concerns. The first one is to, as you said, Shilpen, get notice covered by the scheme. So if you terminate and pay in lieu of notice, then that can't be claimed back from the scheme. But if you leave the employee on furlough, then you can claim back a portion of that, or 80% of that notice pay from the scheme. So that's one consideration, which is obviously going to save money. But the other one, as you mentioned then, Shilpen, about telling people as soon as possible. I think a lot of employers now have got an idea about what roles are going to be needed going forward and what roles aren't. And I think the businesses I've been speaking to feel almost obliged to let people know, so they're not left in a sort of a little bit of an unrealistic bubble. Yes. And then they just suddenly, it's dropped on them at the end of October. And I mean, I'm obviously, anyone on furlough has got to be thinking, is my role going to be around? But, you even if you're not going to actually sort of pull the trigger on the redundancies now, I think it's good practice to at least be having these discussions with employees so they kind of know where they stand and then they can start, make looking elsewhere, basically looking for other jobs.
Absolutely. And I think that feeds in, Paul. Well, one, it's just decency, basically, to treat your staff with a degree of respect so they know what may be around the corner. But also, and this will feed into some of the points we're coming to, where if you're going to look for a more creative or inclusive solution to dealing with your workforce and your staffing requirements, a very good place to begin is by having a genuine dialogue with your staff and with that workforce. So all the more reason, I think, to consult, but to consult in a genuine way rather than going through the motions.
Just on that consultation point, obviously if it's 19 or less employees, then there's no set time frame. But as Shilpen mentioned, if it's 20 or more, you're into 30 days. 100 or more, you're into 45 days. And so, if you want to make redundancies before you have to start contributing on the 1st of August. The 45 days starts today. If you want to start the 45 days consultation before the end of October, it's the 15th of September. So I think you'll probably see quite a lot of action from certainly larger businesses on those dates as they just gear up to make sure that consultation period ties in with either contributing or the scheme ending. It's
a sad thing that the scheme might end up being used for these purposes, but at the same time, it still softens the blow. It still, sort of allows, hopefully, more time for economic recovery and a degree of rehabilitation. Flexible working is going to be, I think, an increasing theme going forward. Because the landscape has really changed. It looks as if social distancing is here to stay for a while. All of the stats, all the sort of the research that's being done suggests that there's almost a sort of a national phobia at the moment of sort of, in terms of contact and interaction between people in terms of physical proximity. And this in itself is going to lead to, I think, a lot of changes in the way that employers and the workplace is going to reposition itself. There is an existing framework and regulatory framework for requesting flexible working, so that even if employers don't expect it or anticipate it, you will find, I think, that increasing numbers of employees on the back of the extended furlough and the pandemic sort of period will be asking and triggering the scheme and asking for flexible working. Paul and I both think it's really important for employers to be thinking about these things and to be planning for it, and to have, I would say, a more positive reaction to it if possible, because you're not obliged to, you're obliged to consider it. You're not obliged to approve or to permit flexible working. And there's a lot of scope for refusing if you want to. But query if that's the appropriate reaction right now, when many employers, and even the most skeptical of employers, I think, have discovered in recent months that actually flexible working and things like working from home are very, very sort of viable. So yes, I think now is the time to start planning and have an approach and have an idea of how you want to approach flexible working requests, because they're going to become more commonplace.
And as you say, it's going to be very difficult for businesses to refuse it if that's the way that people have been working for the last 6 months. One of my clients has put out a sort of a temporary flexible working policy, kind of partly anticipating this and partly, I think their view was that, it's, for some people this is working great and they're doing work. For some people, they just think that they're not actually, doing as much. So they put this policy in place to say, anything now, any flexible working now is temporary, and it's kind of without prejudice to any, formal requests. But it's a mitigation step. But I think the reality is that it will just come down to, in practice, what's been happening. And I think if someone's been working well from home for 6 months, then it certainly puts the employer in a different position to how they were beforehand.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Then, which actually leads us quite neatly onto the next point, which is about creativity and looking at ideas to avoid redundancy. Paul, over to you.
Yeah, sure. So, in order for a redundancy to be fair, as part of the consultation process, the employer has to explore with the employee ways to avoid redundancy. And so, whilst we are now firmly in new territory in terms of circumstances for redundancies, the tribunals are still going to be using the same principles, if and when they come to looking at any unfair dismissal claims. So that's going to be there. And there's an obligation on the employer to give it some thought. And it's an obligation on the employer also to, take into account what the employees say, any ideas they've had. And I think that the tribunals are going to expect people to be open-minded about this. And it does lead to, I think, some potential for creativity, for thinking about things like job shares or, reduced hours or perhaps even sort of slightly bigger picture issues about, how the business operates, any ways that you can kind of streamline or change how you do things to avoid making redundancies. I think if they're things that you can look into, or if they're ideas that the employees suggest, you're going to need to really look into those. In addition, didn't come up in the redundancies that I've been advising on recently, but I thought the employees may raise them, but they didn't. But the other idea is whether you can just keep someone on furlough until October. So you can give notice now, but the employee says, well, look, just furlough me until October and you can reclaim part of my pay. Now, it may well be that because you're going to have to contribute from August, that's not financially viable. I think you'll just need to do the sums to kind of demonstrate that. So so I think it will be a time for probably looking at quite a few creative ideas to avoid redundancy.
Absolutely, Paul. I agree with that. I mean, I think touching on the point you just made about an employee sort of negotiating an extension of their furlough, I think employers have to be a little bit careful about that, because yes, they're entitled, they're able to do that, and it's well within their discretion to do it. But I think it's important to remember the actual purpose of the scheme, basically. And I think given that all of the applications for the grant are open to scrutiny, I think an employer that is too cynical about it could be asked for trouble, basically. Which is why I think when it comes to settlement agreements and negotiating these sorts of things as part of the settlement agreement, I think it's important to be cautious about how far it becomes one more thing in the mix of negotiations. You see. Because it is different to an employer saying, fine, we'll dip into the piggy bank and we'll give you an extra month's pay, or give you 2 months pay just because we like you, or because you've scared us with the prospect of a claim. I think here you're saying we will dip into the public purse just because we can. And I think I would just say I think employers have to be a little careful, although of course very much will depend on the individual circumstances of that, won't it, Paul? It's you'd never just encourage it sort of on a blanket basis, I think.
Yeah.
I think, and the other point I wanted to make here, because I think it's very easy to look at employment law and to look at the requirements of employment law as the bare minimum. It's what you want. An employer knows what they want to do already. How do we implement it? Let's talk to the lawyers. Let's just push this through. We just want to avoid any claims and avoid any exposure that comes out of it. But I think this is possibly the best opportunity there's going to be for a very long time to come, for us to genuinely rethink kind of how we want businesses to run and how we want our businesses to run, basically. And so I would say, rather than seeing it as, we're required to consider alternatives to redundancy, let's just go through the motions, this is actually a really good time to be looking more closely at sort of, is there a more flexible way to retain your staff? Do you even want to retain your staff? What do you see is the future of your business? Is it better, for example, to have half of your employees on a minimum, on a part-time working contract, but with the option of further hours being added on a rota, for example? Is that better than losing, a half or a third of your employees? And is it better to consult with them and give them the option of doing that as well? You could do it on a trial basis. There's many things you can do to avoid the straightforward, we've got excess capacity, we need to lose people, and we have to reduce headcount. And I think both of us would really strongly recommend that as being something that's important, not only for your business, basically, because it'll be far better if you can retain good staff than to cut too quickly, basically, and find later that you need to recruit and go looking for the same people that you wish you might have retained or kept. But also there's the broader question of trying to support the economy and trying to support the workplace, basically, right now at a time when it's very much under threat. And then really that also dovetails into the last point, which is really actually us leaving you with a question, which is this the end of work as we know it? And I don't want to get too philosophical about it, but the reason I say that is because this is such a reset, or potentially such a huge reset of the workplace and the work scenario as we know it. I mean, Paul and I were discussing earlier this morning before the webinar that, query whether even the concept of a permanent employment position is actually applicable. I mean, it's never been permanent in the first place. It's always been terminable and subject to termination. But query whether we're now looking at more short-termism in terms of work. Short-termism could be a positive thing in the sense it could just mean more flexibility, and it may mean that people have more than one job at a time. I mean, Paul mentioned an example earlier on, didn't you, Paul, about someone you knew who had actually increased their income during the pandemic period by taking on 3 or 4 part-time roles rather than just one job.
Yeah.
So I think there is quite a lot to be done on both sides, whether it's employers or employees, looking at how this impacts on them. But to me, the one really big question I think here, and it's going to be interesting to look back at this, not now, but perhaps with a lens of hindsight in a year or two or a few years' time, is this the time when we will start to normalize a 4-day week? Because it is one way, I think, to really genuinely kind of not just rethink the work-life balance, but also to look at the ways we're working, but also how much we work and how we spread the revenues, the money, the finances that are available basically throughout the economy, where the actual need for work, even before the coronavirus pandemic, was reducing. So it's a question, and the answer is really possibly over to you. We're quite happy, Paul and I, to discuss that with you in the time if time permits.
Thank you both. We've had a few questions in, so I'm going to read out the question, and if whoever's question it is wants to unmute to add anything to their question or comment on your answers, that would be great. So the first one is from Justine. She said, if I bring people back but I've overestimated the amount of work, can I put them back on full furlough?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, yes, yes, you can, Justine. Yes, you can.
Thank you. That was an easy answer.
It was easy, yes. Obviously, for July, as of July, make sure. It would apply to those who were already furloughed at least once by the 10th of June. But no, if anything, I think this is precisely the point: is you have the flexibility that wasn't there before, and that's why. It's been a bugbear of mine since the scheme started that it's a shame that it hasn't allowed this sort of flexibility, but you now have it, Justin. You will have it as of next month.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next one, Annette has asked 2 questions. So I'll read the first one out initially, which is, can an ER insist that all employees take their holiday entitlements even when on furlough leave?
Can an employer insist that an employee takes holiday on furlough? And the answer again, Paul, is?
Yes, they can.
Yes, they can.
I think they can. I mean, you've got to be reasonable. If you're going to require employees to take holiday, you've got to give the minimum notice. So under the working time regs, you've got to give, the period has got to be twice the length of the actual holiday. So if you want them to take a week off, you've got to give them 2 weeks notice. There was this argument is, I think, losing a bit of steam, but there was an argument in the kind of midst of lockdown as to whether a holiday could be a holiday whilst you're in your house, basically, because the purpose is to kind of give the employee, leisure time, relaxation time. But, now we can, go out and, okay, fine, it might not be the best holiday you've ever had, but you can get a break from work. You can go away, although you've got the 2-week quarantine. So I think the answer is yes. You just need, if someone comes back and they give you some reasons as to why it's not reasonable, I think you just need to give that a little bit of thought.
Yes, absolutely right. But no, the answer is categorical. The government did finally clarify this because there was quite a lot of confusion around it. Ideally, you want your contract to provide for this and to make provision for having a degree of oversight of when holidays are taken. But yes, it can be done. There is. The advantage of doing that, of course, is that you're then getting the holiday allocation taken up, and you're not building up a big bank of untaken holiday. I advised a client on this recently, where otherwise you might find that you bring employees back from furlough, and they've got that they're looking for holiday relatively soon afterwards, or they're carrying forward their holiday, and they're one of the concessions that's been made in recent months is they can carry holiday forward up to 2 years, I believe it is. So you do have the option of doing that, but I think there's something to be said for making sure that employees do have their holiday, and there is a legal requirement to try and achieve that in the existing year if you can. One practical point to make there as well is that if you do make them take their holiday during the furlough period, they've got to receive their 100% salary over that period. So it's fully paid leave, basically, as opposed to furlough paid leave. And be careful not to fall foul of that.
Thank you. And then the other question from Annette was, is there a statutory period within which you cannot re-employ employees after they have been made redundant? E.g., in a situation where they need to be made redundant now to reduce costs, but when business activities improve, you want them back?
Paul?
I'm not aware of there being a minimum. I mean, I guess if it's the key point is whether for the redundancy to be fair, there has to be a genuine redundancy at the time the decision was made. So at that time, if there wasn't the work, that's a genuine redundancy situation. If work picks up later on down the line, and often people that have worked there are good candidates because they know the business, they know the job. So.
Absolutely. And in practical terms, the only person that might lose out in that scenario, and that is the employer, because you'll have to make the redundancy payments, the requisite redundancy payments, which could actually be quite expensive if you've got long-standing employees, only to find that you want to recruit some of them back again soon afterwards. But there's nothing to stop you doing it. As long as you lawfully terminate an employment contract and meet the statutory obligations that go with that redundancy termination, there's nothing to say you can't hire them back tomorrow. There may be issues around if you're paying, if you've got a settlement agreement, and if you're making payments under a settlement agreement, where I suppose if you're paying in lieu of notice, even then a payment in lieu of notice would be fine, I think. But obviously garden leave has to be factored in. So if you have to look at the actual termination date, and query whether, is it better, if you think you're going to need the employees back, to either put them on garden leave or ask them to work their notice in the hope that you might withdraw the termination anyway by the end of that period. So that may be, query if that's a better way to do it. But it throws up some interesting questions.
That's what happened in a case I was involved in last week, where they had employees who had been there. They were long-serving employees that had notice periods of about 10 or 12 weeks. They were conscious that work might pick up, so they've given them their notice. They're on furlough during their notice periods, and as you say, Shilpen, if work does pick up in that time, then you can offer them jobs and potentially avoid the redundancy payment.
Well, I think that's a good thing. And ultimately, the name of the game, of course, is to try and preserve jobs to the extent that a business can support that. So I think it's got to be a good thing.
Great, thank you. And the final one, so if anyone else has a question, please pop it in the chat bar, is from Garsler, who said, can my employees refuse to work hours I would like? If they say they have childcare issues, what can you do?
It's a tricky one. With flexible furlough, it has to be agreed with the employee. So, Ghazala, you'll have to agree, try to reach agreement with them. I think everyone's got to be reasonable, but the childcare point is a big issue because, it's looking like the schools aren't going to, this is probably it now for a lot of years. And up in Liverpool here, my son's in year 1, but the school aren't reopening. And even in September, it's actually looking like that might not be a full. So that's got big potential impacts on childcare, how much people can work. And I think there's no easy answer to it. You just have to be, you have to be, I think, reasonable and flexible and try and work out a pragmatic solution. You can furlough people if they have got childcare issues, but I appreciate that doesn't address the point if you want that person to be in work.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with what Paul just said, isn't it? I think it's a matter of being practical, Ghazala. I think taking a bit of a common sense approach to it. And ultimately, let's be honest, this comes down to the value of this employee to you. If the employee is someone that's valuable, then that's all the more reason to be accommodating them to the extent that you can. But there will eventually come a discussion or a consideration, at least, of whether an employee that isn't able to accommodate you and fit in with the requirements of the business is someone that you're able to retain going forward. Because the backdrop to all of this is redundancy right now. I'm not saying you should dismiss someone because of their childcare responsibilities. By the way, all I'm saying is it's just a practical issue that if you cannot find a middle ground which makes it viable for you to retain this employee, then query whether you're looking at a bigger question of redundancy and whether that employee is actually able to continue working with the business within your requirements going forward, really. Because in many ways, this leads to a restructure, and that's the backdrop to redundancy is restructuring and a reallocation of excess capacity, you see. But Ghazala, I hope you can agree something sensible with the lady.
Lovely, thank you. That's all the questions we've had, unless anybody wants to come off mute and ask anything to Paul or Shilpen.
Absolutely. Or if you've got any thoughts about some of the points we made, or what you think the future of work is, because it's something that certainly we're quite exercised about and quite interested in, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ghazala.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Right, thank you.
Okay, cheers. Thanks all.
Take care. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.